All right, everybody. This is a follow-up to our CE from last week on June 18th with Janet Yates on hoarding disorders, just the first part of what is it. You guys had a lot of great questions for us, and so we're back here with Janet to ask some of those follow-up questions. Welcome back, Janet.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for your questions. When we do an intro presentation, it's hard to get deep. And so some of the questions that you're asking are going to let us go there. So thanks for doing that and for being so engaged in last week's webinar.
Right, so our first question, somebody wrote in and said they were a self-diagnosed hoarder and they've tried downsizing. They're now in a tiny house and they want to take the next step, but they're still just feeling surrounded by stuff, and they're healthy, their animals are healthy, but they don't have that support system they feel like.
Sure.
To go, what's a good first step for somebody in that situation?
Well, first of all, way to go. I mean, that's not an easy thing to come to be ready to change your behaviors and to do something different. And not being able to do it on your own is very normal. That's very, very common response. So there's no shame in reaching out for help. And that's what I would suggest that you do. I would suggest that you contact a professional organizer who has been trained in hoarding. That person will give you the kind of assistance and help you need related to getting rid of some of the stuff or making sense of the stuff, but also understanding that you do hoard. And so the issues are going to be different than a client who doesn't hoard. So here's some ways to get connected with professional organizers who have hoarding training. First, you could go to the Minnesota Hoarding Task Force, and that's mnhtf.org. And they have resources of organizers who have hoarding training. The other thing would be to contact one or both of the professional organizer associations. So you go to their national websites and you can click on the state of Minnesota and even the area that you live in, and that lists all the professional organizers in your area trained on hoarding who are taking on clients and who could help you with that. So the first organization is NAPO. That's the National Association of Professional Organizers, and they are napo.org, I believe, or com. Sorry, I don't remember that off the top of my head. But you could also just put National Association of Professional Organizers in the search engine, and that'll come up. Again, click on your state and then click on your area, and you'll get some resources that way. The other organization of professional organizers is the Institute for Challenging Disorganization, ICD.org. Same deal. National website, go to Minnesota, go to your area, but make sure that you're looking for a professional organizer trained in hoarding. There's going to be a difference with folks that aren't trained in hoarding. But those are three good ways that I think you could access professional organizers that could be helpful to you. And they will do a variety of things. You know, maybe they just meet with you once and you sort of outline a plan and then you carry it out, or maybe they meet with you multiple times. It really gets to be about you and the organizer creating a plan for what works best for you. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you. And I know we did have a couple folks that were actually international. I know somebody wrote into us from Scotland. Maybe even with, you know, the coronavirus outbreak, are there typically, you know, strictly online or virtual resources?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't know. When I was working with the Hoarding Project, I had more contact with people in other states and other countries. But I did a quick search before I got on this Q&A, and even some of the organizations that I had known that were pretty solid, I was seeing that they hadn't updated their website since 2016. So it's sort of resources for hoarding come and go. The suggestion that I would make is that you, in the United States, you put in your search engine hoarding task force in whatever state you're interested in. At one time there were, gosh, I think it was 47 task forces in the US. And again, there's different funding or no funding or volunteering, that kind of thing. So I'm not quite sure just how many task forces are around. Those are the best resources into a particular state, at least to get started, you know, like if you're looking for a therapist or an organizer or something like that. Internationally, it's more difficult. I know that there was a man in England, I believe he was located in London, and he was doing work with hoarding. And I think he called his organization something around clutter and hoarding. So it was sort of a both and. I don't know if he's still doing that work. And I know that that's not Scotland. I know England is not Scotland. But what I say that to say that he might be a good place to start, and he may have more referrals. I know that there have been a few people in Australia that have been doing some work with hoarding. My suggestion would be to put in your search engine hoarding resources in the country and see what comes up. And don't be surprised if nothing comes up, or if you get old information, or it's just very hard to do this work around hoarding. The countries that have socialized medicine and that have more healthcare options and insurance for people may have more hoarding resources, because, you know, insurance would cover that work. But I don't have good resources for you. I'm sorry. Again, maybe the Minnesota Hoarding Task Force might have some resources internationally as well as nationally.
Great. And you mentioned that you have a blog too that might be a good starting place for some folks. You want to give us that information?
Yes. Yeah, that blog is Scene Clean, like scene of a crime, scenecleanmn.com, and then /blog. And probably by mid or end July, all of the blogs will be posted. There's about 15 posts, and I think 2 drop a week. But you'll get way more information. Thanks for asking for the blog. You'll get a lot more information. It goes a little bit deeper. But remember, it's going to be more about information about hoarding itself, or treatment plans, or that kind of thing. It's going to be less about resources beyond the list of books and things that I gave you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Our next question is, do you have any we just did that one, international. What are your thoughts on animal hoarding? We had several questions about that.
Great. So animal hoarding, remember in last week's presentation, I said that we don't have a stereotype of a person who hoards. You know, the old idea of the older woman who doesn't have a lot of money, that's just an old stereotype that doesn't fit. But when we come to animal hoarding, often the stereotype fits. What we're finding with animal hoarding is that there's a lot of older women not in a relationship that see the connection with the animals as where they get their love and affection. Animal hoarding has some similarities and some differences to object hoarding. So let's quickly talk about that. The similarities with animal hoarding and object hoarding are that they bring in too many, excessive acquisition, right? That definition of hoarding. So excessive acquisition of animals. There's no certain way that people hoard animals. Some people only hoard cats, or some people only have birds. Other people will have all kinds of animals. So there's no distinction there. It's difficult to, well, we wouldn't say discard. It's difficult to get rid of the animals or to let them go. Can't use the rooms in the home because there are animals all throughout that home. and emotional distress and impairment. Again, if we're keeping in mind that the person who hoards animals sees those animals as their way to have affection and love, they're going to be very reluctant to let go. What we also know with animal hoarding is that it usually coincides with object hoarding. And part of the reason that the homes are not safe either for humans or animals is because there's so much stuff in the homes. The differences between animal hoarding and object hoarding are with animal hoarding, 100% of the time you have squalor because there's hazardous material. There's no way that the person who hoards can keep the house clean enough with all those animals. So there's always going to be squalor 100% of the time. Whereas with object hoarding, not necessarily so. You can't just assume that there will be hazardous material in a hoarded home full of stuff. It may be clean stuff. With animal hoarding, what we've done is we've left the world of mental health and we've moved into the world of mental illness. So there is a lack of reality. And you see this if you've ever seen an interview. You know, on the news, they'll go to the hoarded home and they'll show animal control taking out all the animals and all this, and they'll have the reporter, you know, maybe talking to the person who hoards, or, you know, and that person will firmly believe they love animals and they take good care of animals. Well, we're all watching hundreds of animals coming out of an apartment or something, and we know there's no way that person is taking good care of the animals. They've broken from reality. So we can see some co-occurring disorders with diagnoses like schizophrenia and other mental illnesses that people hold. So this is not, animal hoarding is not a mental health issue. Animal hoarding is a mental illness issue. And in fact, I heard, I think it's just a couple months ago, that there is a team of people who work with animal hoarding who are trying to get the diagnostic manual to make animal hoarding an entirely separate diagnosis, which I think would be fantastic, because there are just so many differences between animal hoarding and object hoarding. So if you've got a situation in which you think that a person is hoarding animals, the only way to deal with it at this time, and probably for quite some time, is to contact either animal control or the sheriff's department in your town. The reason I say sheriff's department is that those towns that don't have animal control, the animal control is handled through the sheriff's department. So if you're concerned about a home, or you're clear that there's a home that has hoarded animals, you need to contact animal control or the sheriff's department. We know way less about animal hoarding in terms of causes and all of that. Way less research has been done, but there was a former professor and veterinarian at Tufts University in Boston who did probably about 20 years worth of great research and work on animal hoarding. And I got to meet him probably 5 years ago, and when I introduced myself and we started talking, he said, "So you're mental health?" And I said, "Right." He said, "Where have you been?" He said, "For the last 15 years, we veterinarians have been trying to work with hoarding, and we know this isn't about animals, this is about something else." And he's right. Where have we been? It's a very good question. We need a lot more work to be done to better understand it, but this is what we know. There's a break from reality. There is an insistence that they love and care for these animals, and that's their belief. And we have to enter that logic for a time, rather than arguing with them. "Oh no, you don't care about animals, you don't love animals." We have to just go along with them in the sense that we're not going to change their mind by arguing with them. The reality is that many, if not most, of the animals in a hoarded home have to be put down because they are so ill and diseased and not taken care of. But some can be rescued. So it's a tough one. It's a very difficult situation. I myself have worked with one hoarding client who hoarded animals, and I couldn't get very far, if at all. Again, that sort of break from reality didn't invite therapy at that time, and the response simply had to be to move the animals out, which I'm sure moved that person more into their mental illness diagnosis, which is, it's a tragic situation all the way around.
Right, because what you shared last week was that, a lot of times that forced clean out, which is more or less what you'd be looking at with animals, results in, worsening of some of those symptoms down the road. So I can imagine that's
Absolutely.
the same thing.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you for speaking on that.
Yeah.
Somebody else asked, is there a better term to use besides hoarding? And, especially when talking to a loved one, just with the stigma and the stereotypes around the term hoarding?
Yeah, great question. I always want to move in my work with clients or in my consultation with people. I always want to move us in the direction of being able to label what is happening as hoarding. We need to call a spade here. But oftentimes that takes a relationship. Before I can start talking about hoarding, I need to talk about the clutter, or there's too much stuff, or your home isn't safe because of the amount of things in the home. That's how I would suggest starting out, especially if you have someone who's just going to argue with you. I don't hoard. Yes, you do. No, I don't. You get stuck and you don't get anywhere, which nobody likes. It does, and it doesn't help maintain the relationship. If you remember, that's really key for family members and professionals too. So I would say just use that language of, I'm concerned about the amount of stuff that's in your home and how it inhibits you from being able to live. And remember, you go around the rooms rather than the behavior of the hoarding. So I'm concerned for you that you can't take a shower in your bathroom. You've told me that you sleep on the couch because your bed's full of stuff. Those kinds of things. Just start using just different language that really is describing hoarding, but not using the word hoarding itself. And when there's a relationship there, and when there's an openness, being able to label it as hoarding, and still care about the person who hoards, or still let them know that you don't think less of them because they hoard, that kind of thing. I think that starts to go a long way for us changing the cultural stigma. But use the language that you need to begin with, and clutter does work. I mean, people who hoard have a lot of clutter. It's, of course, the definition that we use for clutter is different, but that if that gets you in the door, if that gets you to be able to have a conversation, then use that word. Sure.
By all means, thank you. And kind of related to that is just wondering how accurate of a picture that television shows like Hoarders paints, and how that influences the stereotype either positively or negatively.
So this is one of those situations that I could go on a rant for a long time about how I feel about the so-called reality TV shows, which aren't reality at all. I won't go on the rant, but I will say this, that those shows, Hoarders and there's Hoarding, and there's another one, they only give you a small look and a small percentage of the people that are hoarding. It is true. The reality is there that people do live in homes that have insect infestations and animals living in their roofs, on the roof, and that kind of thing, as well as dead rats in the refrigerator, and all of those sort of really exciting shows that they put on. That's a small percentage, though. The majority of people who hoard don't think it's okay to live with your feces and urine. They don't think it's okay to have hazardous materials and animals running around. So the majority of people have too much stuff. and their houses may not be clean, like there might be dust or there might be some mold beginning because they can't reach the areas in order to clean, that part of the house. But they're not making set decisions about bringing hazardous materials into the home. So the problem is that, yeah, there's some reality to the shows, but it's like this much. The majority of people who hoard don't live that way. So it doesn't make for exciting TV if you just have a house that's full of too much stuff, too many boxes or that kind of thing, and you come into the house and you say to the homeowner, hey, ready to get rid of this stuff? And they say, sure. Nobody's going to watch that on TV. We will watch, mom screaming at daughter because daughter threw away a candy wrapper that was hers, and then that kind of thing. That's much more interesting TV. So those shows don't work, and they don't show us the true picture of hoarding. Also, they present, they go in for a week, they film for a week with a person, and about halfway through, or maybe a couple days into the filming, then they bring in a therapist. Now, the therapist is not always a therapist. Might be a psychiatrist, might be somebody who is in the mental health profession but doesn't work with clients. So it gives this impression like you've got someone coming in who's going to help heal this person and, help them process. They end up doing more harm than good, because eventually what happens in a week, the house gets cleaned out, and the homeowner is watching it getting cleaned out. So they're getting distressed. So then the mental health professional comes in and ends up stirring up things more. The reason I'm so against these shows is that I did the aftercare for a person who had been on the show. And the particular, I think it was Hoarders, I don't remember, but they would pay for up to 6 months of therapy. I think I got to talk about the hoard once in that 6 months, because the man was so traumatized by what had happened to him that all we could talk about was trauma, which makes sense, but their idea that we're going to help this person and we'll pay for therapy to help them address the hoarding, not going to happen. So it's unrealistic, and I can guarantee you that I bet almost 100% of the people who have been through the show and, at the end they said they're moving along and not hoarding, have probably returned to hoarding because they didn't deal with it. So that's my rant in a very short period of time. Don't watch the shows. They're not helpful for you to understand hoarding and for you to have a better view of what really happens with hoarding.
Awesome, thank you. Maybe we'll do the extended version of your rant. All right, I guess we have two more kind of spheres of questions to ask you. Would you be able to briefly touch base on the connection between grief and hoarding?
Yeah. So when I talked with people who hoard, as well as their family members, and remember I said that there's a lot of unresolved trauma and loss in the lives of people who hoard, and that sort of is what catapults them into the hoarding behaviors. What I have found in talking with those folks is that kind of the main reason they go to hoarding is because they're too afraid to deal with the grief. It feels too scary. It feels like they'll drown, that they won't survive if they deal with the grief. Now, as a trauma and grief specialist, I can tell you this: there is only one way through grief, and that's to go through it. There's only one way through trauma, and that's to go through it in order to get to a place where you can move into your life. So holding the grief, avoiding it, pretending that it's not there, the thing is, grief just waits. It just waits for us. I've had people come to my office and say, my husband died 20 years ago. Why am I still grieving? Well, there's lots of reasons. It may be because you had this wonderful relationship, and grief can grief can be healthy and with us for a long time. But it also might be that you've avoided grieving, you've pushed it aside, and instead of just disappearing, grief said, I'm going to stay here until you deal with me. And that's what grief does. So that is why I say that if we can get a person into a safe space, if we can get their home safe, the work then is to help them process that trauma and loss, is to help them grieve. And when they can understand that the grief is not going to kill them, that the grief will be painful and it'll be hard, but it's something that they can live through and live with and move into life with, then they don't need, I'm going to call it the crutch of hoarding. They don't need that other behavior to take their mind away. So talk to family members and ask them, when did you notice that your loved one started hoarding? And a lot of times they'll tell you, oh, it's when this event happened, when dad died, or when mom left, or when we all moved out, to go to college, that kind of thing. That's grief. And it's okay. We need to normalize grief, not just in hoarding, in everything. Grief needs to be normalized and made to be okay. That's life. And we grieve because we had relationship, and that relationship has shifted or changed or gone away or whatever the situation. So that's the connection for me with grief and hoarding. And the only treatment for it is to help the person process the grief.
Great, thank you. And our last question that we have is, does downsizing your home tend to help or hinder your hoarding tendencies?
Let's say it this way. Downsizing your home won't change your hoarding tendencies. What changes your hoarding tendencies is to change your hoarding tendencies, is to do the work of understanding why you hoard, understanding why you have so much, and then to change that. Downsizing, what I found is that it feels like a great idea. Like, oh, if I downsize, I just won't have as much room. But remember what I said in the beginning? It's not about the stuff, it's about why the stuff exists. If you just have a smaller house, you will find other places to put the hoard. So this is why we have people living in apartments with hoarded apartments, and then 6 or 7 storage units that are full of stuff. So it's not about minimizing space and then all of a sudden that magically takes care of the issue. It's not about the stuff. There's something more inside why that stuff is there, and we have to get at that. If you decide after you understand why you hoard and you try to change that, and then you move into a smaller place as a way to help you continue that work, I think it's a great idea. But it's not moving to a smaller space will not help or hinder. It won't change anything. And so you've got to do the inner change to have the outer impact.
Great, I think that's a great way of putting it, is that it doesn't change anything.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for answering these follow-up questions.
Sure.
We had a lot of long-term care discharge planners and long-term care social workers and nurses that joined us. Do you have any last-minute thoughts for them, or maybe words of encouragement for the folks that they have moved into their communities that are maybe bringing their hoarding tendencies with them?
Yeah, I think you guys are doing really difficult work, and the reason that I say that is that I hope you understand that. Because if you understand that the work that you're doing is really difficult, my hope is that you'll get support for yourself, that you will do your self-care, that you will recognize that in this difficult work, you can't do this alone. And a lot of times you are put in positions of having to do this alone. And my encouragement to you is to keep reaching out for support, for your supervisors to help you come up with a plan the more that you can work with other people as a team, the better that it will be for you. It'll take some of the pressure off. So again, contact the Minnesota Hoarding Task Force and find out other professionals in your area that you could team with. I know that money is always an issue, but for the long-term care and that, this is where I think the caddy waiver may come in, the elderly waivers may come in to help a bit. So get some support if you can, get other people involved. That resource that I had on the last slide of the PowerPoint called the Hoarding Handbook by Bradiotis, read that. That will help you know what other professionals work with hoarding and maybe could be part of a team with you. Reach out to the Minnesota Hoarding Task Force. Get some assistance there with how they are recommending people work together. And maybe you'll be the catalyst for bringing a team together that not only helps you, but helps your clients and would help other professionals working in the area not to feel so alone. And because you're really up against it. You have not only the patient to work with, but you have their family members to work with, and then you're told, hey, you got to discharge this person and you got to get them back home. They can't go back home, and so you have a very difficult job, very layered job. I hope this gives you some help, but raise this as a group. I mean, get a group of you together and let's figure out how you can get some support around that. And you may just have to start personally, making sure that you have your own personal support for this tough job.
Wonderful. Well, Janet, thanks again for your extra time and answering some of these questions that our attendees had. And we'll look forward to having you again do another virtual CE with us coming up in the next couple months.
Great. Thanks, everyone.